Cool. And we're going to have Jax Petty today, who is phenomenal when it comes to, is your nickname the Godfather of seller financing? Is that what they're calling it? So such a valuable conversation in this market. This is a seller financing market. And you want to have the knowledge, the understanding to put your sellers in the best situation possible, but also be strategic when you approach your buyers, how to help them get under contract in these high interest rate conditions. And so we're excited to have Jax here. And Red Sign team was had him a couple of months ago and actually talked about how phenomenal the experience was. And so we wanted to have him back in here. And so without further ado, we'll turn it over to Jax.
Well, thank you. It's always good to be at an awesome brokerage like this. Has anyone in here read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill? Okay. Do you remember the story 3 Feet from Gold? Yes. For those of you that haven't, that's kind of the market we're in for agents. But the story, to make a long story short, is this gentleman risks everything. He goes to Colorado and finds one of the richest ores of gold veins that they've found, goes back home, gets his friends and relatives to invest in all the machinery he needs, goes back, and shortly thereafter the vein disappears. Guy sells all his equipment for just a few $100. The guy that bought his equipment brought in an expert that told him the vein should be 3 feet to the right. And the guy went, and it was exactly where the expert told him it was going to be. So the reason I bring that up is my real life experience has been for the agents that understand seller financing. Right now they're on the gold. Like, we're as busy as we've ever been. And if you think about how crazy things were for title companies when rates dropped and the refi boom was going, or last year at this time with all the purchases, that's saying something. In fact, Hunter, since we did that training, how many seller finance closings have the Reds?
It was like 12 and 60 days.
Yeah, 12 and 60 days. So I'm going to give you some of the tools that the agents that are doing this successfully are using. I've only got really, besides now the Red Sign group, one agent down in Utah County that's also doing it well. So there's a lot of fruit available. So to give you a little bit about my background, and at the end, I'll give you my contact information. Please do yourselves a favor, put it in your phone, because sooner or later you're going to want to have this. But I'm a real estate attorney. I'm also the president of First Liberty Title. I've closed thousands of seller financing transactions, and a lot of those are me as an investor. And if you are in the investment vein or work with investors, that's a different class that we teach. But in the past 6 months, all of the properties I've purchased, I've convinced the sellers to leave their financing in place, including the one that was at 2.5% interest. And again, different set of circumstances, more time. I'd go into how you do that. The art of negotiation is letting somebody else have your way. But it's difficult for me to narrow things down to a 45-minute time frame. I've taught week-long seminars on this before and still feel like we're touching the tip of the iceberg. So I want to give you enough information that you know what questions to ask, that you know how to start taking advantage of the market. But it's going to probably take more than just 45 minutes for you to be fully competent. But let me ask you a question. How many of you waited till you knew everything about real estate to close your first deal? I've never seen a hand go up when I ask that question. And yet, I will hear agents say, I really need to know more before I close my first seller financing deal. So don't fall into that trap. But let's start with some benefits to the buyer, because right now there are a lot of buyers sitting on the sidelines. Would you agree with that? What is their biggest I'm waiting until excuse? Interest rates. Right? If you'd been the one to find that property with the 2.5% rate the seller was going to leave in place, would it be difficult for you to find a buyer to pick that property up? Come on, that's an easy question. That would be easy, right? So at the end, we'll go into some ways that you can find those properties and those buyers. But they can take over the seller's interest rate. Now that's different than an assumption, right? An assumption, the bank participates. But understand, those sellers with good rates, if you can find them and plug them in with the buyers, you'll be as busy as you've ever been. But another thing that we find is that no credit qualification is a big one. And when I say no credit qualification, if all you heard was poor credit buyer, you're missing the point, right? We've got a lot of people that own their own businesses. In fact, a lot of the high-end stuff we close, it's because the buyers just don't want to deal with the banks. They don't want to disclose all of their assets to any one party. We did one where the builder sold it on seller financing. The buyer made over $1 million a year. But because his company had done a little bit worse this year than last year, he couldn't get a bank loan because he had decreasing income. And he only needed $450,000 in income to qualify for the loan. There's some weird things, but everyone, including myself, I could go get any loan I wanted, is a potential seller finance buyer. And any seller, now why are sellers sitting on the sidelines? Price, right? They know their house is worth $500,000, even though Zillow tells them it's worth $450,000 right now. And what we've seen is a lot of agents that understand what they're doing with seller financing, getting those higher sales prices. The sales price the seller wants, because the buyer is buying a separate asset than just the property. For bonus points, what's the separate asset? The financing, exactly. So seller financing properties, if you know what you're doing, you can typically sell those for 10% above market value. And I don't anticipate they will, but if short sales come back, we had groups that were doing seller financing instead of short sales and killing it, or doing seller financing as part of a short sale. So who's done a short sale before? What's the longest short sale anyone's done in here? 2 years, 21 months? We had one that was over 4 years. It was crazy. But the other thing I love about seller financing is we have clients that say, like it'll be a Wednesday, they'll send us the order and say, we want to close on Friday. You can do that with seller financing because you don't have to wait for a bank to fit somebody in a box. All right. Anyone else invest in here? Okay, a few. Right? It's kind of a pain to fix up the properties. Let me tell you something that I've started doing. I'll buy the property that needs the 60 grand in fix up. I will sell it at the ARV price to a seller finance buyer and require in the contract that they do the repairs. That's pretty cool. If you're an investor, you might like that. If not, maybe it's not that important. Let's talk about some of the benefits to the seller. This is the one that is absolutely killing it right now. If you've taken no other notes, right? The Take Your Interest Rate With You program. So we have agents that are sending this out to their SOI in their marketing, and they're getting phone calls. Well, how do you take your rate with you? Because that's what every seller wants to do, right? They don't want to sell their house and make a lateral move, which is buying the same asset class somewhere else and double their payment. So Hunter already knows this. He came to the last kind of class we went over, but the way you take your interest rate with you is you take the benefit of the interest rate. So let me give you an example we just did. Seller's interest rate was 3.5%. Seller sold it on seller financing, full price, 7.5% interest. Who's making more money on the bank's money, the bank or the seller? That's pretty cool. I like making money on the bank's money personally. They like making money on my money. It's a mutual relationship. So in this particular closing, this gentleman was downgrading. He was going from the big family house to something that he and his wife wanted. And the old house actually made his complete new house payment. That's better than 0% interest. Now, we're also putting prepayment penalties in on those because we don't want the buyer paying it off in a month or two. I saw one that I thought was a little draconian. I'm not sure how it would work out with some of the liberal judges, but they put in a $100,000 prepayment penalty for 30 years. Now, contractually, you can do that. I wouldn't recommend it because, like I said, sometimes judges make their own decisions, but that is a really cool program, right?
if you could go talk to every seller that's sitting on the sidelines that you know, or within, let's say, a 5-mile radius, do you think you'd have some listings right now that you didn't have otherwise? Now, the question I get is, well, great, we sell that person's house. They've got to go buy another house. So this is kind of level 501 stuff. And again, if it feels like a fire hose, I understand that that's hard to drink from, but hopefully something in here helps you do another deal. Like, that's the purpose of why I'm here. So you can do what's called a hybrid lease option contract for deed, as long as you're working with the right lender. You're shaking your head. I like that. People that get it are going to kill it right now. The hybrid is, you started out as a lease option. You use the lease to help them qualify for the new payment on their property they're buying, and then it automatically converts to the seller financing contract for deed. Now, if you're sitting there and you're saying, contract for what? I mean, is he speaking English? That's okay, right? Because you've got brokers, you've got other agents here that have done these, and you can ask those questions. You can call my office, we'll answer your questions. A lot of times I'll get agents that are just starting out. They'll send me the REPC and the seller financing addendum, and they'll say, here's what I think it should be. And I'll kind of redline it and give it back to them. And that's actually really cool for the agent. Because how many agents can go back to their client and say, I've run this by a skilled real estate attorney, and these were the suggestions he's made and why, right? That edifies you. So it's all about helping you guys kind of do more business in this market cycle. And I hate to say that I look forward to this market cycle, this part of the cycle, but I absolutely do. And the agents that understand it absolutely do as well. Let's see. We've talked about that. Tax benefits we'll probably go into on a different class, but very briefly, it can be a huge thing for people that have investment properties and are tired of being landlords, or this is one I'm seeing a lot lately. You have the older couple, they've got a house in Salt Lake and a house in St. George. And a winter like this, they decide to sell one of the houses. Which one? Right, Salt Lake. And they've been spending more time in St. George than Salt Lake. So according to the IRS, now their primary residence is in St. George. So if they sell that paid off $600,000 property, what tax bracket are they in? Top. But if they sell it on seller financing, they're only taxed on the money as they receive it, assuming they have a competent accountant. If their accountant doesn't know how to do that, tell them to get a new accountant. But it also qualifies for the capital gains exemption. Even if they're not paid off for 6 to 10 years, as long as they occupied the property 2 of the past 5 years when the sale was transacted, it still qualifies for that capital gains exemption. So I have some agents, they'll use that as a powerful selling tool. They'll say, sure, you can sell your house for $500,000, but you're going to be receiving a net of $250,000. If we can sell it for $50,000 more, your net is still within that $500,000 range. Get them another $500,000 tax-free. And if you don't understand how that works, I get that. We can go over that maybe at the CE class. By the way, we'll be teaching our next CE class on the 15th of February. I will send out, I think I already sent the link to your person that does all of this, so I'll have her send it out to you. But then also I think we're going to try to do one here. Is that correct? Okay, so we'll do a 3-hour core. The 3-hour class is actually really, really good for agents. I think you can walk out of that fully understanding enough to be dangerous. But now let's get into kind of what you need to know, right? In the CE class, we take a lot of time going over what types of seller financing are, what the default remedies are. I had a great discussion with your broker before the class about that, because I realize everything on the internet is true, never. And he understood that, but he asked about something that was actually very dangerous, so I'll touch on that. If you ever have a client that tries to walk you down the path of doing a seller financing transaction in the form of an all-inclusive trust deed and note, or a trust deed and note. By the way, anyone know the difference between those two? Yes. One has a mortgage, the other one doesn't. So the easy memory trick, all inclusive includes all other loans. That's really the difference between the two. The default remedy for both is a foreclosure. Now, what I was getting asked about was, can you just put a deed in escrow so that if the buyer doesn't pay, you can take the property back? Now, I want you to think logically, right? If it was that easy, isn't that what every bank would do? Right? They don't like to spend money on attorneys. I don't like to spend money on attorneys. But if you could get around the statutory requirements of a foreclosure, that's what everyone would do. You can't. So just understand, if you do that, if you put a deed in escrow and you record it, you have not transferred ownership back to the seller, only title. And the buyer will win when he sues the seller and anyone involved in that transaction and get damages. And then on top of that, force the seller to do a judicial foreclosure. So if you read that on the internet or you hear about it, hey, let's just do it this way, I can explain to them, or you can explain to them, that's actually a very bad idea for that seller. Last year I was teaching in the CE class and afterwards had an agent come up and said, that's how I did it. And I said, pray they don't meet a good real estate attorney. But there are three types of seller financing. I want you to understand the benefits of each one, right? And so if we're doing the CE class, we actually have a handout with some categories and you fill in each one. But if you want to freehand it, that's great too. Do you guys know any ways to do seller financing? Anyone have an idea? What are some of the document sets? You mentioned one. All-inclusive trust deed and note, excellent. Contract for deed. The other one starts with L, ends with EASE option. Excellent. So yes, you've got to, and now I've probably done seller financing 100 different ways, including very complex corporate entities where a percentage of the entity itself transfers over time. You're not going to need that, right? If you do, we'll talk. But 99.99% of the time, it's going to fall into one of these three. The lease option is a lease with a cross my heart promise, I'll sell you the property at a certain price option. I've defeated options in the past. So this is kind of for your weak buyer. It's not going to be a super strong buyer generally that does a lease option. I have also seen where some creative investment groups are using lease options and they try to twist it, right? They try to make it very strong for the buyer. And let me just tell you, I have friends that are judges. Their calendars are very full and they may not take the time to read your fancy language. They may say, I know what a lease option is. I know what it does. I even wrote one in law school, and they'll rule accordingly. And you got to pay 40 grand to do an appeal. So always use the correct document set. Lease options definitely have their place. They have some value when it comes to sellers that want to sell on seller financing and immediately buy another property while qualifying for both loans on their debt ratios. We're going to jump to number 3 now. We're going to come back to number 2. Number 3 is an all-inclusive note and deed of trust. And the reason the slash is in there because a normal note and deed of trust is kind of the same thing. It just doesn't have an underlying loan. Now, this is the strongest position for the buyers. The buyers are on title and they have ownership. If you think those are the same thing, that's not correct. All the county is a registry where if you record something by statute, everyone in the world now has notice of what you recorded. Even on a normal transaction, when you close with a bank loan, ownership actually transfers at the point valid consideration is given for the deed, not when it's recorded. Recording just puts the world on notice. So as a buyer, when I buy as an investor, I'm always buying on an all-inclusive, with one exception. This would be the second thing I would say. If you've written nothing else down, write it down. Do not ever do an all-inclusive over FHA financing. Yes. VA does not have the same naughty list requirement. In fact, VA put out a circular stating that if you do a contract for deed seller financing transaction over one of their loans, it's not even a violation of their due on sale clause. Never ask an attorney, no worries. I would, oh, I've done it. Absolutely. Yes, that's a much better question. Yeah, so, yes, I will. If you are caught by FHA as a licensed professional, you could get banned from life from ever doing a closing where the buyer was getting FHA financing. Your brokerage could be banned for 1 to 5 years. So, pretty strong reason. Now, there was actually another, I don't use air quotes that often, but I'm going to use it, attorney that was saying that wasn't the case. He was up in Salt Lake. And so I wanted to know, right? I don't go off of what I think. I go off of what I know when I'm giving legal advice. So I actually had my staff spend weeks calling the FHA regional office until they got so sick of those Monday morning phone calls, they finally let me talk to the regional supervisor, the vice supervisor, the head legal counsel, and then some guy. Still don't know who he was, but he talked a lot, right? And I asked them, I walked them through each one of these. Now, all of these are a violation of the due on sale clause. By the way, this is one of my favorite questions. Raise your hand if you've intentionally violated the due on sale clause on a loan. Okay, so the rest of you have not written a REPSI in your lives. Is that what I'm to understand? Because if you read those clauses, they say, any actual or potential transfer of a beneficial interest in the property is a violation of the due on sale clause. The REPSI, although not as strong of an equitable transfer as a contract for deed or lease option, is absolutely a violation of the due on sale clause. None of you should be afraid to write a REPSI. I'm going to suggest none of you should be afraid, if you do it correctly, to do seller financing when it comes to the due on sale clause. In fact, I've only seen 2 in 25 years where the lender said, we're going to start a foreclosure. They were both, for bonus points, anyone want to guess the lender? How did you know? No, Utah Housing, who said that? Nicely done, yes. There is one group, bless their souls, that is completely, I was going to say a bad word. Vigilant. I'll say vigilant. Nothing about making diamonds. We'll go with vigilant. They will check. By the way, lenders don't pay title companies to go research the title to see if it's changed. They don't have to. What do they get every year? 2 things. Insurance renewal and property tax. Well done. So they don't need to go search it, but Utah Housing actually looks at the property tax to see if the title has changed. So twice I've had frantic phone calls. One was from the title company that closed the all-inclusive because they knew they were in trouble. The other one was just from an agent that was trying to save their buyer. Both times we redid those as a contract for deed. So a contract for deed actually leaves title in the seller's name. It only transfers ownership. And that's not some magical new creation. It's actually, if you research all the way back in English common law, it's one of the earliest forms of selling properties, right? It existed before banks. But if that twists your brain a little bit, it shouldn't, because if you ever bought a car with a bank loan, you did the same thing. Auto financing borrowed it from real property. When I buy a car with a bank loan, right, it's my car. I drive it, I insure it. Can I sell it? Yeah. Could I refinance it with a different credit union? Yeah. Who's holding the title? The lender. On a seller financing, who's the lender? The seller. But it's the same thing. The lender's holding the title. So much less risk of a due on sale issue. I had a call last week from an agent that said my seller wants to do seller financing, but they are terrified of the due on sale clause. And when they found out there was a way to do it without transferring title, that agent got the commission. It was good. So, brief synopsis. Lease option, title and ownership vest with who? Okay, this is the rule when I ask a question, right? Unless I'm at home, it doesn't work with my family. Everybody should shout out an answer, because if you proudly shout out the wrong answer, you will never forget the right answer, right? But if you quietly sit there, you're like, wow, I'm glad I didn't say buyer. You're going to forget. So take the time, right? So lease option. Who has ownership and title?
Seller.
Nice. All inclusive. Who has ownership and title?
The seller.
Oh, I love it. Buyer. Buyer has ownership. Buyer has title. Contract for deed. Who has ownership?
Buyer, seller.
Love this. Okay, you've had a moment to think about it. Who has ownership under the buyer? Perfect. If you shouted out seller, I love you. Well done. But it is the buyer. Who has title? Seller. Right? You guys are all seller finance experts now. I promise you know more than most of the agents that you're competing with. So you can do some really cool things with those tools, and that's what they are, is tools. And I have some people that think last year at this time, nobody was doing seller financing. That is absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. I have one agent that did 84 seller financing closings in the past year. That's pretty good. So I want to keep within my timelines. So again, I'd love to go into more detail on this. Let me touch on a few key things. And by the way, sometimes people will say, what's your favorite form of seller financing? I don't have a favorite. But based on the circumstances, some definitely work better than others. So when you do an all-inclusive, if the buyer defaults, let's say in all of these, they put down 100 grand. If the buyer defaults, who keeps the $100,000? Seller does. Who keeps the payments? Seller does. Let's say they did the seller financing transaction a couple years ago. There might be a few hundred grand in equity now, right? If the buyer defaults, the seller's remedy is a foreclosure. Unless they can convince the buyer at the time of default to do a deed in lieu of foreclosure. We won't go too deep into that. But you've got a very good situation for the seller because they get to keep all that stuff. But what do they really want? They want that equity too, don't they? So this is one reason when I sell on seller financing, I sell on a contract for deed. Because if I sell on an all-inclusive, I have to do a foreclosure. At the end of that, there's a public sale. Every one of you in here can show up, bid $1 more than I'm owed as the seller, and who walks away with that equity? You do, right? But if I sell on a contract for deed, there is no public sale. There's just a forfeiture process that eliminates the contract. And all of that equity comes back to the seller. So that's a pretty cool thing. I actually have a guy up on Wasatch Boulevard. He sold his property 3 times and paid it off. He called me up. He's like, this property's cursed. I'm like, cursed? It's a gold mine. Now, to my credit, I did not go buy every haunted house in Salt Lake and sell it on seller financing. But let's talk about how they can be used in combination. A lot of times you'll have a situation, as I mentioned, where the seller needs to go immediately buy another property, right? And they can't qualify for both payments, but if they have rental income on the first property, they can qualify for a loan. Now, this is the point I say, never, ever shade into the area of committing loan fraud. You make sure to have full disclosure with the lender. So there are some lenders, and I've got a list of them, that they know how to do that. They can disclose everything to their underwriters, investors, and it works flawlessly. There are certain lenders where their heads catch on fire and then explode, and it's not pretty. So just in all of these, make sure you're working with a qualified lender. One of the things that I absolutely hate is when I get a call from a lender that doesn't know what they're doing and they're trying to refinance a contract for deed. Now, if you want to know if your lender understands seller financing, just ask them, what is your protocol for refinancing a property where the buyer is not on title? And if you instantly see flames on their head, probably not the right lender. Yes.
So this excludes FHA or is it?
No. You can do FHA refis, absolutely. FHA, VA, conventional, USDA, they all have guidelines for it. Now in back east and on the coast, contract for deed is used a lot, right? Utah actually came up with their own version of the contract for deed. I think we're kind of famous for taking things that aren't broken and fixing them in this state. The problem is there's no lender guidelines for refinancing a uniform real estate contract. Otherwise, that would be the one I would prefer. But we want to make sure we're setting up our buyers for success. So if you're going to do a seller financing transaction where the seller needs to immediately buy another property and they don't make enough income to qualify for both loans, we'll go through how to write up that contract. Another thing is the seller financing addendum that you guys have on the MLS. I'm trying to be graceful, and it's not CE, so I can be a little more honest, but if I stepped on it, I would get a new pair of shoes. Like, it's that bad. And it has a huge liability hole for you guys that if you follow, you can get sued. And that's something I don't like. I actually was called up to talk to the Real Estate Commission a number of years ago before the last revision. And I gave them 10 things that were problematic about their seller financing addendum. To their credit, they changed one of them. They did put an addendum number on the seller financing addendum. It didn't have one before. So I've drafted one. I'll send it to you guys. You can use it. I think you've got a copy of it already, don't you? One that's been scribbled on? Okay. I'll send you a clean one. It's in Word. You can open it up and just tab through it. It's actually, I think, very beneficial for the sellers. You'll see that there's a lot more meat that needs to be in there to protect the buyer and sellers. And really, please don't do a transaction that absolutely destroys one of the parties, right? You have to understand my underwriting criteria if we're ever working together. It has to be legal and it has to be ethical. I actually once had a guy, he was like, of course it was a guy. He's like, well, what if you get $1 million commission? I said, and I was joking, right? I'm like, well, you better know what countries don't have an extradition treaty with the United States. He proceeded to ask me what countries those were. Surprisingly enough, I've never worked with that individual. All right, so we've talked about the hybrid lease option contract for deed. You can also do a contract for deed to an all-inclusive. A lot of times people will say, what down payment needs to be given in seller financing? The answer is 2 words, it depends. Sometimes you might take less on a down payment because of the buyer's position, right? I've seen that a lot when you have people from California that are selling their home. They need a short-term seller financing transaction so they can move in their home now and live there. And then when their home in California sells, they just pay off the seller financing. Or maybe it's a newly graduated medical student that's going to be making a lot of money, but doesn't have a lot of money now. I've seen those transactions. So don't, like, if you're working with a buyer, understand it's the buyer, not just their down payment or not just something else that's going to qualify them for the seller financing. I saw one that I would never thought would happen. This was about 2 months ago. The total down payment, 3.5%. Because the seller had already moved, and at the last minute, the buyer's lender dropped the ball. That would never happen to you guys, right? No. And the seller was the one that said, hey, let's do seller financing. Because we don't want this property back. We don't want to market it again. We like the buyers, right? They'd read the letter. Do you guys ever do that? Send the offer with the letter. These are the best buyers in the world. I love that. So yeah, they did it for 3.5% down. The agents ended up taking back their commissions. But if you're going to do that, aren't you also lending the seller money? So they got interest from the escrow company that was doing the monthly payments. They got monthly payments on their commission interest until it gets paid off, and then they'll get the rest of their commission. That's pretty cool. By the way, third thing I'd have you write down, if you're working with clients, use a monthly escrow company. Unless you love math and you like phone calls right about December 31st asking you to calculate the buyer's 1098 interest with additional principal payments and how does that affect the amortization, just use an escrow company. All right, let's finish. The finish line is this. I'm going to tell you how people have really built kind of businesses in this climate doing seller financing. And we've talked about how you can get sellers, right? The Take Your Interest Rate With You program. Most people start with buyers because they know buyers that are interested. They're waiting for rates, or maybe they're not waiting for rates. They're just not in a position where they can get a loan. It may shock you to know there's a lot of high earning people that got destroyed by COVID. Their business stopped and now they're back in business and they're earning money. So how do you get buyers? So if you start doing a bunch of these, I will call and ask you, how are you doing this? Because I think the more people that know how to do this, the less affected our market is by what banks are doing or what the government's doing or what rates are doing. And we can just keep on going and letting people buy and sell homes. My favorite one is a lending partner. You had a lender bring lunch in today. Is he still here? Excellent. Have you ever had anyone walk into your company that had a big down payment but couldn't immediately qualify for a loan? Okay. All of you should go talk to that gentleman. Right? And here are the statistics, right? If you take, for example, an average Chase branch, and I bank at Chase, not because I think they're awesome or like their fees, but they can send wires till 4:30. And my clients like that. So that's why I'm with Chase. But I can get access to their branches and their loan officers. They'll have, on average, 10 people a month. So out of the 30 to 40 that come in looking for homes, they'll have 10 that have big down payments but can't immediately qualify for a loan. How would your life be as an agent if you had one branch sending you 10 clients a month? That would be pretty awesome, right? So use those lenders. Like when they're marketing you, ask the question I just asked. And if they're at all decent as a lender, they're going to say absolutely. They've got those people. Short sales, it's a much better answer when you're talking to somebody that needs to do a short sale. And there are people that bought at the peak of the market that are actually upside down right now, especially when you add in 6% to an agent and 1% or 2% closing costs. They do not want to do a short sale. They will not sell their house. They will sell their house if they can walk away with money. So if you can sell it for 10% of a market value, you can probably do that. And then like when they were actually in the short sales, what we'd have them do is save the money they weren't paying the bank. And then once it was time to leave that house, they would go buy one on seller financing that they could actually afford, which is pretty cool. Because as an agent, do you prefer one commission or two? Two, but you also really helped a family, which is one thing that I loved about that. KSL and Craigslist, I'll tell this very quickly because I want to respect your time. By the way, is this valuable information? Is it worth? Okay. Had an agent come to the class. He started getting permission from his listings to put the property information on KSL, Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, Zillow, and he would put, I specialize in non-bank financing contract for deed. And the reason he put that was nobody knew what contract for deed was. So he'd get calls from sellers, he'd get calls from buyers. And this particular one was a call from a seller. Seller had a high-end property that had been on the market 9 months. They'd been playing the drop the price game, still hadn't worked. He explained to the seller what it was that he was doing, how it worked. The seller said, I would love to do that. At that point, the seller disclosed that they already had an agent. He said, I'm sorry, I can't be your agent. You're already represented. Why don't you go talk to them about doing it? So the seller went and talked to their agent. You know what their agent said? Even worse. Oh, I don't do seller financing. He can have the listing. So my agent gets the listing, raises the price, right? Completely counterintuitive. Why would you raise the price on something that hasn't sold for 9 months? Any guesses on how long it took him to sell that property? 8 days. The offer they accepted, $300,000 down. The backup offer they accepted in backup position was $150,000 down. So then he took the seller, bought another property. He double-sided the close with the 300 grand down. And we thought that was the end of the story. That was a great, great series of closings for him. Unfortunately for the buyer, buyer's wife kicked him out, moved in buyer's wife's boyfriend. Buyer, in retribution, stopped making the payments. Seller took the property back and sold it to the $150,000 backup offer. He only got half the commission on that one, but he did pick up the original buyer's $2 million Park City listing that he then sold on seller financing. He actually, if you go in his office, he's got a trophy with that property address on it. It's pretty cool. But don't forget, one of the most searched for terms on the internet is seller financing. So whatever you're doing to separate yourself from other agents, I would suggest including that, because we're in a seller financing market. Other agents, right? One of the guys I have that does the most closings on seller financing will not let me teach this class at his brokerage. Any ideas why? They just hand them to him. He gets half the commission for basically calling me, but anyway. Past clients, make sure your past clients know that this is an option, right? How are you going to phrase it? Is it going to be the take your interest rate with you program? Is it going to be, do you know anyone that needs to buy a property but doesn't like today's interest rates? But the cool thing is, once you have one or the other, once you have a listing and you know what you're doing, you can use it to build a huge buyer pool. And buyers pools makes listings easy. Right? We had a guy come to the class. He specialized in calling expired listings. There's a few of those popping up again. And instead of using the line, and I'm paraphrasing, your last agent wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, and doggone it, people didn't like them. Anyone recognize the reference? Excellent. Yes. He was able to say, I have buyers that want to buy your property. One of them has 60 grand down. One of them has 80 grand down. Could we meet? Much higher percentage of listings. If you work with investors, if we had time, I'd go into some of the systems that they're using or some that I use. Large corporations is great. We had a guy that had it in with UDOT. UDOT was kicking out a bunch of people on the Western Bench for the new corridor, and they had a problem. That problem was this. A bunch of those people bought their homes when you could just basically sign and drive to get a loan, right? It may or may not have been your social security number you were using. Anyone doing business back in like the early, before 2008? You guys remember those days? I remember walking by the closing room and it was a $2 million closing and the buyer was still wearing their Subway uniform. And I thought, this is a little interesting. But if UDOT kicked these people out and they couldn't go buy another home, they were paying a lot more in damages. And if you don't understand why, imagine you're my jury, right? And I've got this poor family sitting next to me, and I'm asking you how much the home you live in is worth, right? The place where your kids have grown up, you've got the marks on the wall. Is it worth just what some government appraiser says the equity is? Well, what if you can't go buy another house? You're now a permanent renter. Now how much is it worth? Right? That's a much bigger equation, bigger damage they had to pay. So this agent called UDOT, set up an appointment. He said, hey, I want you to be available in case we have any questions. So I blocked out a half hour of my time. And this is how the phone call went. Hey, Jax, we're all here. Okay, go ahead. But I was able to help them understand, help UDOT understand. It was legal, it was safe, it was valid. And so they started sending all of those people to this agent, even though they had an in-house UDOT agent. You know, the smallest check he had to go find a property with was $74,000. So the big corporations that are transferring people in and out, they may be transferring somebody in that earns a lot of money, but still has that house on the coast that they haven't sold, so they can't immediately buy another house. Be the agent that finds them. What do you guys have here in Utah County that is a big corporation that transfers people in and out? Adobe, excellent. A couple universities. One that starts with G, ends with Oogle. You guys have some cool stuff going on down here. So don't understand, when those people come in, they want to buy a home. They don't want to be a renter till their own old home sells. Find those people. Business owners. Anyone know anyone that's self-employed in here? Yes? So you know it's not easy to get a loan when you're self-employed. Listings, like I said, you can use those to get them. But my second favorite one is this one, 7 referrals. The average person that does a seller financing transaction as a buyer or seller knows 7 people in a similar circumstance. So get those leads. Oh, is somebody taking a picture? I can put it back up. Okay, everyone got it? Okay, so in the CE class, we'll go over a lot more on the system, but if you're working with buyers, make sure you're working with a lender that knows how to fix their credit instead of you trying to do it. Use your listings to get new buyers, but please always begin with the end in mind, right? Always make sure you're setting up a successful transaction. Don't put your buyers in a 2-year seller financing transaction if they just had a foreclosure and a bankruptcy, because they're not going to be able to refinance in 2 years, right? And maybe you work with a good lender that tells you those timelines, pre-qualifies your buyers. That's one of the things that I put on my form, is it gives you the option as agents to have the seller finance buyer pre-qualified by your lender that you know will tell you the truth. There's some other reasons legally that I think that's a good idea that we won't go over now. But I think that if you have the experts that can help you to not make mistakes, right? That's our job. Your job is to go and find the clients and find the ways, not just to make commissions, right? We're all doing this to make money. But I have seen several times in a seller finance closing where the buyers get up and with tears in their eyes hug their agent and say thank you. I have never seen that with an 800 credit score closing. It could happen, maybe it happened to you, but I think the helping people side of it's pretty cool too. So take a picture of this, but if you really want to be smart, put it in the actual contacts. If you look at my phone, I've got a bunch of contractors. It'll be like Joe, Sidewall, so-and-so, electrical, right? I really should know their last names. I don't. I know what they do, right? Because that's what I want to search for in my contacts. So you put Jack Seller Financing. Weird Attorney is fine too. I don't care. But take advantage of what this market is offering, right? I love the fact that the agents that figure out how to take advantage of markets are part of the ones that play into the most millionaires are made in downturns, not upturns. Because this is the time in the market when you can really do some cool things. Thank your brokerage for inviting me in. I will thank them as well. But was that worth spending a little bit of time together? Excellent. Oh, wow. Thank you for that. This may shock you, but most attorneys don't get applause. I really appreciate that. Now I think we've got Q&A. Is that right, or is it you're kicking everyone out for lunch? What's the plan?
We did have one question on Zoom.
Yes.
Someone asked, and it was about insurance. So the seller keeps it in their personal name, and the buyer makes the payment. So is there an insurance claim the seller will the seller have issues?
That is a beautiful question. So insurance is an important thing to understand. If there is a lender, which most of the time there is, most seller financing transactions, the property is not paid off. That lender will only pay insurance if their borrower's name is on the insurance. So if the buyer just gets a new policy, that's not only bad from the standpoint the lender is probably not going to pay for that policy, it's also bad because you're taking a red flag and waving it in front of the face of that lender saying, hey, a sale took place, right? So generally there's 2 options we see done. First option is the seller changes their policy to a landlord policy, and then the buyer gets a personal property and liability policy. You might have heard it called a renter's policy. That's probably the most common. If you do nothing, if you do not change the seller's insurance to a landlord policy, the insurance company will try to reject the claim because they'll say, nope, you've got a full coverage policy, but you're not living there anymore. And this may shock you to know insurance companies don't get rich by paying claims. Yes?
Could you have the insurance and we'll keep the insurance in place and the taxes all paid by the escrow company and just make that one payment.
So the problem is you have an underlying escrow account at the lender that's already collecting for taxes and insurance.
Well, if they have that kind of a loan.
Yeah. And so the majority of the time, that's what you're going to be facing. Now, your point is very valid. If the buyer, if the seller is not paying taxes and insurance in the monthly payment, that's a much easier equation. You might be able to make that change. There are some insurance agents that actually know how to show both parties, buyer and seller, as primary insureds. I know of a couple, but most agents, we're back to the heads catching on fire, and it's very messy. So that's one way to do it, is just change it to a landlord policy, have the buyer get a personal property and liability policy. If it's paid off, then you would have the buyer get a new policy showing the seller as a lender insured party. That's how you do it. Excellent question. Any other questions? Okay. All right, I guess I've just explained everything. That's awesome. Well done. Thanks. Thanks, brother. You bet.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we have pizza in the back, sponsored by Introland. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And if you have any questions, yeah, reach out to Jax. I have his addendum that I can send out to everyone, so I'll mass blast that. Thanks everyone. Get all these slides, right?